who disappeared 10 years ago, has been found.
Police once again confirming that they have found the remains of 18-year-old Rory Hache. Disturbing developments in the murder investigation of Rory Hache.
She was a spunky kid.
On a late summer morning in August 2017, Rory woke up feeling something wasn't right, a quiet, creeping sense that her body was giving in before her life ever had a chance to begin. She reached out for help, not knowing it would be one of the last decisions she would ever make. Within hours, she would step out of a hospital door and disappear into a world that would never return her whole. And for weeks, no one would know where Rory had gone or what had been done to her. Rory Hache was just 18 years old. She lived in Oshawa, a city known for its working-class roots and quiet neighborhoods stretching along the edge of Lake Ontario. To outsiders, Oshawa looked like a place where life moved predictably: families, schools, factories, routines. But like many cities, beneath that surface were struggles that didn't always make headlines. And Rory's life existed in that space between what was seen and what was hidden. She was born in 1999, into a complicated world that she never chose. Rory's early life was shaped by instability. Her mother, Shannon, tried to protect her as much as she could, working hard to give her daughter some sense of normalcy. But there were forces surrounding their family that made that difficult. According to reports, Rory's extended family had ties to organized crime, including connections to the outlaw motorcycle scene in Canada. It was a shadow that lingered in the background, one that Rory grew up trying to understand and perhaps trying to escape. Despite everything, those who knew Rory didn't describe her as defined by her circumstances. They described her as a girl who laughed easily. She had a soft, youthful face, one that still carried the innocence of someone who should have had years ahead of her to grow, to change, to figure things out. Friends remembered her as kind, sometimes shy, but also fiercely independent in ways that made people both admire and worry about her. She wasn't someone who liked being told what to do. She wanted to make her own decisions, even when those decisions came with consequences. Like many teenagers, Rory was searching for identity. But unlike many teenagers, her search came with heavier risks. By the time she reached her mid-teens, something began to shift. The independence she craved slowly turned into distance from school, from structure, from the people trying to guide her. Reports later revealed that Rory began experimenting with drugs during this time. What may have started as curiosity or escape soon became something much harder to control. By the age of 16, she was struggling with addiction. Methamphetamine. It changed everything. Addiction has a way of reshaping a person's world, narrowing it, isolating it, pulling them away from the people who love them most. For Rory, it created constant tension between her and her mother. Arguments became more frequent. Trust became harder to maintain. And eventually, the gap between them grew too wide to bridge in the moment. At just 17 years old, Rory left home. It wasn't a dramatic, one-time break. It was gradual, the kind of drifting away that happens when someone feels they need to survive on their own terms. But once she was out there alone, reality set in quickly. Life without stability meant finding ways to survive day by day. And survival came at a cost. According to investigators, Rory became involved in sex work. It wasn't a choice made from opportunity. It was one shaped by necessity, addiction, and the absence of safer options. It placed her in environments that were unpredictable and often dangerous. It meant meeting strangers. It meant trusting people she didn't know. And yet, even during this time, she wasn't completely alone. Her mother never stopped trying to reach her. School guidance counselors also remained in contact, checking in on her when they could. They saw something in Rory that was still worth fighting for, a sense that she hadn't gone too far, that she could still come back from where she was. There were glimpses of hope. By the time she turned 18, Rory was pregnant. It added another layer to her life, one that was complicated, uncertain, but also deeply human. There was now a future connected to her own, a responsibility, a possibility that things could change. But change is never simple, and sometimes it comes too late. On August 29, 2017, Rory reached out for help. She contacted one of her guidance counselors, telling them she had taken drugs and was feeling intense pain and discomfort. It wasn't vague. It wasn't casual. It was serious enough that the counselor didn't hesitate. They went to her. They stayed with her. And they made sure she got to the hospital. Inside that emergency room for a brief moment, Rory was safe. She was surrounded by medical staff. She had people who cared about her nearby. There was a chance, however small, that this could be a turning point, that this moment could lead to recovery, to stability, to something better. But then something happened. Just 15 minutes after arriving, Rory got up and walked out. No one stopped her. No one knew where she was going. There was no dramatic scene, no argument, no visible urgency. She simply left, stepping out of the hospital and into the open world beyond its doors. And then, she vanished. At first, it wasn't immediate panic. People who knew Rory understood that she lived a transient life at times. There were periods when she wouldn't answer her phone, when she would disappear for a day or two. It wasn't completely unusual. But this felt different. Her phone went silent. No messages. No sightings. No trace. By the next day, concern turned into fear. Her mother tried to contact her repeatedly, but there was nothing. The guidance counselor who had been with her at the hospital knew something wasn't right. Rory wasn't just avoiding people. She was gone. And soon, she was officially reported missing. For weeks, there were no answers. No confirmed sightings. No evidence of where she had gone after leaving the hospital. It was as if she had stepped out of that building and into nothing. But somewhere in Oshawa, behind closed doors, a truth already existed. A truth that no one could see yet. A truth that would take weeks and a horrifying discovery to uncover. Because while Rory's family searched, hoped, and waited, someone already knew exactly where she was and what had been done to her. Long before Rory walked out of that hospital, before her name would echo through courtrooms and headlines, there was another life unfolding quietly in the same city, one that, on the surface, looked ordinary enough to avoid suspicion. His name was Adam Jeffrey Strong. He was 45 years old in 2017, living alone in a basement apartment in Oshawa. To anyone passing by, there was nothing about him that immediately stood out. He wasn't known as violent. He didn't have a public reputation for causing trouble. In fact, for most of his life, Adam existed on the edges of attention, quiet, forgettable, unremarkable. And that was part of what made him so dangerous. Because predators don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the man next door. Adam worked as a security guard at a local movie theater. It was the kind of job that required little interaction beyond routine observation, watching people come and go, ensuring nothing went wrong. It suited someone who preferred distance over connection. Coworkers didn't describe him as charismatic or outgoing. If anything, he blended into the background. There were no obvious warning signs that would have made people immediately afraid of him. But that doesn't mean there were no signs at all. Details about Adam's early life are limited, but what is known paints a picture of a man who lived in isolation for long periods. He had been in a relationship at one point, but by 2017, he was living alone after that relationship ended. There were no reports of stable, long-term friendships, no strong social network, no visible support system. He existed in his own world. And inside that world, something was deeply wrong. Investigators would later uncover disturbing elements within his apartment, items that hinted at fantasies and behaviors far removed from what anyone around him might have imagined. Sexual devices, restraints, tools that suggested control, domination, and violence. These were not things displayed openly. They were hidden behind closed doors, in a space where no one else was watching. It's often said that people live two lives, the one they show the world, and the one they keep hidden. In Adam's case, that second life was where the truth lived. There is no clear, singular explanation for how someone becomes capable of what Adam would eventually do. Psychology is rarely simple, but patterns exist: isolation, obsession, control, the gradual erosion of empathy. When these elements combine without interruption or intervention, they can evolve into something far more dangerous. By the time 2017 arrived, Adam had already crossed a line. Though it wouldn't be publicly known yet, Rory was not his first victim. Years earlier, in 2008, a 19-year-old woman named Candace Fitzpatrick had disappeared from the same area. Like Rory, Candace had struggled with her own challenges, including drug use and instability. Like Rory, she was vulnerable. And like Rory, she encountered Adam Strong. For nearly a decade, Candace's disappearance remained a mystery. There were no confirmed leads, no body, no answers for her family. It became what investigators refer to as a cold case, one that slowly fades from active investigation due to lack of evidence. But the truth never disappeared. It stayed with Adam, hidden, waiting. By 2017, Adam's life followed a quiet routine: work, home, isolation. But there were patterns within that routine that would later raise questions. Investigators found that he frequented areas where sex work was common. These were places where people like Rory, young, vulnerable, trying to survive, often found themselves. It was there in those spaces that paths could cross. And sometimes those crossings were anything but sluchakratkoi in Yeruye. At some point before her disappearance, Rory and Adam had met. The exact details of their first interaction are not fully documented, but investigators later uncovered a photograph showing Rory standing with Adam at a movie theater, the same place where he worked. It suggested that their connection may have started there, in a setting that felt normal, even harmless. A movie theater. Bright lights, people, noise, safety. But connections don't always end where they begin. After that initial meeting, it's believed that Adam and Rory encountered each other again, likely in a very different context. Investigators theorize that Adam may have approached Rory as a client, someone offering money, someone appearing harmless enough in the moment. For someone in Rory's situation, these encounters were part of survival. But for Adam, they may have been something else entirely. Something planned, something deliberate. Because what investigators would later piece together suggested that Adam didn't act impulsively. He prepared. Inside his apartment, everything he needed was already there. The restraints, the tools, the environment. It wasn't chaotic. It was controlled. That level of preparation speaks to intent. It suggests that whatever happened inside that apartment wasn't a sudden act of violence. It was something that had been imagined, rehearsed, and ultimately carried out. And by the time Rory walked out of that hospital on August 29, 2017, Adam was already living in the shadows of his own making. Somewhere in Oshawa, their paths were about to cross again. But this time, there would be no safety net. No crowded theater. No public space. Just a private apartment where no one could hear what was happening inside. Investigators would later believe that Rory entered Adam's apartment willingly, likely under the assumption that it was just another transaction, another moment she needed to get through. She had no way of knowing what waited behind that door. No way of knowing that this man, quiet, unremarkable, invisible, had already taken a life before hers, and had never been caught. In the hours after Rory left the hospital, something irreversible happened. Something that would remain hidden for weeks. Something that would only come to light because of a discovery so disturbing, it would shock even seasoned investigators. But in that moment, none of it was visible. To the outside world, Rory was still just missing. Still somewhere out there. Still possibly alive. But behind closed doors, in a basement apartment in Oshawa, the truth had already begun to take shape. And Adam Strong was at the center of it. Waiting. On the afternoon of August 29, 2017, Rory stepped out of the hospital and disappeared into the quiet streets of Oshawa, and somewhere between that moment and the hours that followed, her life came to an end. No one saw it happen. No one heard her call for help. And for weeks, no one even knew where to begin looking. What happened after Rory left the hospital has been reconstructed through investigation, forensic evidence, and courtroom testimony. There is no single witness who saw every moment unfold, but piece by piece, detectives were able to build a timeline, one that reveals not just what happened, but how completely it went unnoticed at first. After leaving the hospital, Rory entered a familiar world, one where she often moved between temporary places, meeting people in circumstances that were rarely recorded or monitored. According to investigators, she likely connected with Adam Jeffrey Strong sometime later that day. Whether it was prearranged or a chance meeting is not definitively known. But what is known is where she ended up. Adam's basement apartment. A place that from the outside looked like any other unit in a residential building. There were no alarms, no signs of danger, no indication that anything unusual was happening inside. Neighbors lived just above him, going about their daily routines, completely unaware of what was taking place beneath their feet. Inside that apartment, the environment was very different.
And just a couple blocks away from
During the
Oshawa
investigation,
courthouse where Adam
police
Strong
would
is
later
completing his
describe it as cluttered, unclean, filled with garbage and items that had accumulated over years. But beyond the mess, there were objects that carried a much darker significance: restraints, sexual devices, and tools that pointed to something far more disturbing than simple neglect. At some point after Rory entered that apartment, something went wrong. Or perhaps something went exactly as Adam intended. The exact sequence of events inside the apartment cannot be fully reconstructed. There were no cameras, no recordings, no witnesses, but based on forensic evidence and the condition of the scene, investigators concluded that Rory was killed inside that space. The cause of death was never definitively established. According to reports, the condition of her remains made it difficult for pathologists to determine exactly how she died. However, prosecutors argued in court that the killing likely occurred during a violent sexual encounter. This theory was supported by the items found in the apartment, as well as testimony from another sex worker who described a previous encounter with Adam where he attempted to restrain her. It painted a picture of escalation, control, and violence. After Rory's death, what happened next was not an act of panic. It was methodical. Investigators found evidence that Adam dismembered Rory's body inside the apartment. A specialized knife, one typically used for separating flesh from bone, was recovered, and forensic analysis would later play a critical role in linking the crime to him. This was not something done quickly. It required time, privacy, and a level of detachment that is difficult to comprehend. Some of Rory's remains were placed in plastic bags and stored inside a freezer in the apartment. Others were disposed of in a way that suggested an attempt to permanently conceal the crime. According to investigators, parts of her body were discarded into Lake Ontario, where natural elements would make recovery and identification more difficult. For a time, it worked. Weeks passed with no trace of Rory. Her family searched, police investigated, but without evidence, the case remained in limbo. She was still listed as a missing person, her fate unknown. Then on September 11, 2017, everything changed. A man walking along the shoreline with his grandson noticed something unusual near the water. At first, it appeared to be the remains of an animal, but as he got closer, the truth became clear. It was human, specifically a torso. The discovery immediately triggered a police response. Officers arrived, secured the area, and began the process of identifying the remains. At that point, they didn't know who the victim was. All they knew was that they were dealing with a homicide, one that involved dismemberment. News spread quickly through Oshawa. A body had been found near the lake. And not just any body, a partial one. The community reacted with shock and fear. This wasn't something people expected in their city. It wasn't something they could easily understand. Questions began circulating almost immediately. Who was she? What happened to her? Was the person responsible still out there? At that stage, investigators had very little to work with. The remains were incomplete, making identification difficult. The cause of death couldn't be determined. There were no immediate suspects. So they turned to forensic science. DNA testing was initiated in an effort to match the remains to someone in missing persons databases. At the same time, detectives began reviewing recent cases of missing women in the area, hoping to find a connection. Weeks went by, then months. Finally, in November 2017, a breakthrough came. The DNA from the torso matched a sample provided by Rory's mother. The unidentified victim was no longer unknown. It was Rory. For her family, the confirmation was devastating. The hope that she might still be alive, however slim, was gone. In its place was a horrifying reality. Rory had been murdered, her body dismembered, and part of her discarded in the lake. But even with her identity confirmed, the case was far from solved. Investigators still didn't know who had killed her. They still didn't know where the rest of her remains were. And they still didn't know what had happened inside that apartment. For nearly a month after the identification, the investigation continued with limited progress. Detectives retraced Rory's last known movements, reviewed surveillance footage, and followed leads, but nothing pointed clearly to a suspect. Then, on December 29, 2017, a completely unrelated call changed everything. Residents in an apartment building in Oshawa reported severe plumbing issues. Their drains were blocked, and a foul odor was coming from the pipes. It was bad enough that they called a plumber to investigate. What the plumber found was something no one could have imagined. As he worked to clear the pipes, he began pulling out what appeared to be chunks of organic material. Flesh. At first, it didn't make sense. But as more of it came up, the situation became impossible to ignore. The plumber stopped what he was doing, and he called the police. When officers arrived at the building, they were initially responding to what seemed like a strange but unclear situation. But as soon as they entered the basement apartment, the source of the blockage, everything changed. The smell hit them immediately. Strong, unmistakable. The smell of decomposition. Inside the apartment, the conditions were exactly as investigators would later describe: cluttered, chaotic, filled with garbage. But it was what the tenant said next that turned suspicion into certainty. He looked at the officer and calmly stated, "If you're looking for the rest of the body, it's in the freezer." That tenant was Adam Strong. And in that moment, the mystery of Rory's disappearance began to unravel in the most horrifying way possible. By the night of December 29, 2017, What had begun as a routine plumbing complaint had transformed into one of the most disturbing crime scenes investigators in Oshawa had ever encountered. Inside that basement apartment, the truth was no longer hidden. It was undeniable. And at the center of it all was Adam Jeffrey Strong, a man who, just hours earlier, had been living an invisible life. Now he was in custody. The officer who first entered the apartment didn't need a full investigation to understand the gravity of the situation. The smell of decomposition filled the air. The cluttered interior was layered with garbage, decay, and signs of something far worse. And when Adam calmly told police where to find the rest of the body, there was no longer any question. This was a homicide investigation, and it was about to expand. Police immediately secured the scene and began a full forensic search of the apartment. What they discovered inside would form the backbone of the case against Adam, evidence that was not only overwhelming but deeply disturbing. In the freezer, officers found a human head wrapped in plastic. Further examination revealed it belonged to Rory. Other items in the apartment painted a clearer picture of what had happened. Investigators recovered Rory's belongings, including clothing and shoes stained with what appeared to be blood. They also found restraints, sexual devices, and tools that supported the theory of violent control inside the apartment. Among the most critical pieces of evidence was a specialized knife, one designed for cutting through flesh and bone. At first, investigators assumed the biological material on the knife would belong to Rory. But when forensic analysis was completed, the results revealed something unexpected. The DNA did not match Rory. It matched someone else, a second victim. That discovery changed everything. The DNA belonged to Candace Fitzpatrick, a young woman who had disappeared nearly a decade earlier in 2008. Her case had gone cold. For years, her family had no answers, no closure, no indication of what had happened to her. Now suddenly, her name was back, and it was connected to the same man who had killed Rory. Investigators realized they weren't dealing with a single act of violence. They were dealing with a pattern. Adam Strong was not just a murderer. He was a repeat offender who had gone undetected for years. With this new information, detectives expanded their investigation. They began reviewing Candace's disappearance in detail, searching for any connection that could explain how she had ended up in Adam's apartment. Like Rory, Candace had been vulnerable at the time she vanished. Like Rory, she had been navigating a world where danger was often hidden behind ordinary faces. The similarities were impossible to ignore. While forensic teams continued processing evidence, Adam was brought in for questioning. What followed would become one of the most unsettling parts of the entire case. During his initial interrogation, Adam refused to answer questions. He sat calmly, showing little emotion, declining to explain anything about Rory or the remains found in his apartment. Investigators pressed him, pointing out the obvious, that he had already admitted to knowing where the body was. But he remained detached, almost indifferent. For hours, the interrogation went nowhere. But then, during subsequent interviews, something shifted. Adam began to talk. Not in the way investigators expected, not with remorse or urgency, but with a strange, almost casual tone. He admitted to dismembering Rory's body. He acknowledged disposing of her remains. But when it came to the actual killing, he became evasive. At one point, he told investigators that it wasn't important to him. The lack of empathy was striking. Even more disturbing was his behavior during the interrogation process. At times, he appeared more concerned with his comfort than the gravity of the situation. He made requests for food, asking for specific meals as if he were placing an order at a restaurant. He spoke about wanting small comforts while in custody, things like internet access or a television. It was a stark contrast to the horror of what he had done, and it left investigators with an unsettling realization. They were dealing with someone who did not think the way most people do. As the case moved forward, prosecutors formally charged Adam with first-degree murder in Rory's death and manslaughter in Candace's case. Despite the evidence against him, Adam pleaded not guilty. The trial would not begin until September 2020. When it finally did, the courtroom became the place where every detail of Rory's life and death would be examined. Prosecutors presented a clear and methodical case. They outlined the evidence found in Adam's apartment, the forensic links to both victims, and the timeline that connected Rory's disappearance to the discoveries made months later. They argued that Rory had been killed inside the apartment during a violent encounter, and that Adam had deliberately attempted to conceal the crime. The defense took a different approach. Adam's lawyer argued that he did not kill Rory. Instead, the defense claimed that Adam had only disposed of her body after her death, suggesting that someone else may have been responsible for the killing itself. It was a strategy that attempted to create doubt, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. But prosecutors countered with facts. The condition of the apartment, the tools used, the presence of Rory's remains, the connection to Candace, and testimony from witnesses, including a sex worker who described a previous encounter with Adam in which he attempted to restrain her, reinforcing the prosecution's theory of violent behavior. As the trial progressed, the weight of the evidence became impossible to ignore. For Rory's family, every moment in that courtroom was a painful reminder of what had been taken from them. They listened as details of her life were laid out, as evidence of her death was presented, as the man responsible sat just feet away. Then, in April 2021, the court reached its verdict. Adam Strong was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Rory Hache. He was also convicted in connection with Candace Fitzpatrick's death. The sentence was life in prison. Under Canadian law, Adam would not be eligible for parole until 2043. For Rory's family, the verdict brought a measure of justice, but not closure, because no sentence could undo what had been done. No ruling could bring Rory back, and no explanation could fully answer the question that would always remain. Why her? As the courtroom emptied and the case officially came to an end, one truth remained clear. Rory's story was not just about how she died. It was about how she lived, and how, in the end, her life mattered far more than the man who took it. But even after the trial, one final chapter of this story was still waiting to be written, because Candace's family was still searching, and the full extent of Adam Strong's crimes had yet to be completely revealed. When the trial ended in April 2021, the legal system had done what it was designed to do. It identified the person responsible, presented the evidence, and delivered a sentence. Adam Jeffrey Strong was now behind bars, convicted of taking lives and destroying families. But justice, in cases like this, is never as simple as a verdict. Because while the system moves forward, the people left behind remain. For Rory's family, life did not return to normal after the courtroom emptied. It couldn't. Rory Hache was not just a name in a case file. She was a daughter, a young woman whose life had been complicated but still filled with meaning, potential, and connection. Her absence created a space that could never be filled, not by time, not by justice, not by anything. Her mother, Shannon, spoke publicly about the pain of losing her daughter. In court and in statements shared through media, she made it clear that Rory was loved deeply and completely. There is a tendency, in cases involving addiction or sex work, for victims to be misunderstood or judged. But Shannon refused to let that narrative define her daughter. Rory was not her struggles. She was a person who had faced challenges and deserved compassion, not condemnation. That message resonated beyond the courtroom, because Rory's story forced people to confront uncomfortable truths. It highlighted how vulnerable individuals, especially young women navigating addiction, instability, and survival, can become invisible in society. How their disappearances may not always trigger immediate urgency. How their lives, unfairly, are sometimes seen as less worthy of attention. But Rory's case changed that. In Oshawa, her story became a reminder that every life matters, regardless of circumstance. Community members, advocates, and organizations began speaking more openly about the risks faced by people involved in sex work, particularly those who are young and without strong support systems. Conversations around safety, outreach, and prevention became more urgent. Because what happened to Rory wasn't just about one individual. It was about a system of vulnerabilities, and the consequences of those vulnerabilities being ignored. For the family of Candace Fitzpatrick, the case carried a different kind of weight. For nearly 13 years, they had lived without answers. Candace disappeared in 2008, and for over a decade, her fate remained unknown. There were no confirmed sightings, no discoveries, no closure, just questions that lingered year after year. Then in November 2021, something finally changed. After his conviction, Adam Strong led investigators to a wooded area in Oshawa, where Candace's remains were ultimately recovered. It was a moment that brought long-awaited answers, but also reopened wounds that had never truly healed. Closure is a complicated word. For some, it suggests peace. For others, it simply means knowing the truth. For Candace's family, it meant both relief and heartbreak, the end of uncertainty, but the confirmation of loss. And it raised another question that lingers in cases like this. How many others might still be waiting for answers? Because when a pattern of violence is uncovered, it forces investigators to look beyond what is known, to consider what may still be hidden. In Adam's case, no additional victims have been officially confirmed beyond Rory and Candace. But the nature of his crimes, the time span between them, the level of concealment, leaves behind a quiet unease, an awareness that some questions may never be fully answered. Today, Adam Strong remains in prison. Under Canadian law, he is serving a life sentence with no eligibility for parole until 2043. But even within the prison system, his story did not end quietly. Reports have indicated that his crimes, particularly the connection to Rory's family background, made him a target among other inmates. As a result, he has spent much of his time in protective custody. Isolated, separated, living a life that is, in many ways, defined by the consequences of his actions. But even that reality is not the focus of this story. Because this story was never truly about him. It was about Rory, and about the life she lived before everything was taken away. It's easy in true crime narratives for the focus to shift toward the perpetrator, their actions, their psychology, their punishment. But that focus can overshadow what matters most. The person who was lost. Rory's life was not perfect. She struggled. She made decisions that placed her in difficult situations. But those facts do not define her worth. They do not diminish her humanity. And they do not justify what was done to her. She was 18 years old, still figuring things out, still capable of change, still deserving of time. If there is anything to take from Rory's story, it is this: that vulnerability should never be mistaken for invisibility. That every person, regardless of their circumstances, deserves to be seen, to be protected, and to be valued. And that behind every headline, every case file, every investigation, there is a life that mattered. A life that was lived in small, human moments, laughter, conversations, hopes, fears. Moments that are now gone, but not forgotten. Because as long as her name is spoken, as long as her story is told with truth and compassion, Rory's life continues to have meaning. Not as a tragedy, but as a reminder of what was lost, and of what should never be lost again. Her name was Rory Hache. She deserved more time. The world is less bright without her in it.